Hi, my name is Sudarshan, and I've built a React Native app that displays the API data in a way that one might infer insights that might otherwise be harder to do by just looking at the raw data. Right, so there's three paths that one can take on this screen. Either they can start looking at the resources, or they can look at the applications, or they can really dive deep into the applications. These are all the applications that are there in the API data, and for each of these applications in the application deep dive, the resources used by that particular application have been displayed, and the total cost and the quantity of each resource under that particular application has also been displayed. So for example, computers was the application that was the most expensive, and these are all the resources that it uses. And yeah, and cow, for example, had just logic apps, and logic apps it just had Macau. And if you'd like to go into the resources, you could either choose to know about its cost or quantities. Of course, you can come back and look at the other one. And a graph is shown, a graph is displayed, and the data points are the cost of each resource because we came in through the resource path. For example, there's also a legend here to tell you what each number over here is. So for example, the number 2 here costs 2799, and number 2 is Azure App Service, and it costs 2799. You can also these are the list of resources because we came in through the resource line. There's the total cost and quantity displayed for each one of these resources. Some of these resources do have the cost is 0. Yeah. Quantities is the same thing, but the data points are quantity data points. For each of these resources, their quantities are displayed. And applications is the same. There are loads of applications, so there are around 49, and it didn't really, even though I just used just numbers, it didn't really fit. Maybe I should make like a scrollable graph over here. And I should also be using a bar graph because these are discrete values, and a line graph does not really show discrete data. Instead, it shows how one data varies through time or something like that. But it just looks better. Just know that these are discrete values. Oh yeah, the total cost or the quantity is displayed. It would have also been there in the resource. This is the total number of that was the total quantity, and this is the total cost. And 33 has the highest cost. So number 33 is computers. And computers, if you recall, had loads of resources, and it costs the most. The code, well, screen by screen. React Native first opens up app.js, and here I import all the screens used in the app. We'll go through them one by one soon. So the stack navigator is basically this stuff, what's on the current stack and what pops off, and these are basically just screens that are coming on the stack and popping off the stack. And first screen is this screen, and we navigate between the screens using this name prop. Right, so the first screen, what happens is it just shows us resource applications or application deep dive. You can choose one of them and go into that stream. The first screen is also where all of the API calls happen, and I'm just making 3 API calls, one for all the raw data, one for all the application data, and one for all the resources data, and all the other calculations, each resource and each application and all their items and all that kind of stuff. The calculations, I'm doing it myself in code so that the number of hits to the API endpoint are reduced and the performance is high and the server isn't repeatedly being hit by the same client. Yeah, so raw resources and applications is the state where I'm storing all of this API data. So I just take it and then I set it into state, and then this is what is passed on to every screen. I could have used something like Redux, but it's a fairly small application. I could just pass the props in. Right, so home is what this screen is called. This screen is the home screen, and it's the same for either resources or applications. So I used it as a reusable component. I just passed in the name. Where if resources clicked, then the main is resource. If application is clicked, the main is application. And this is no longer the home screen anymore. This is a completely different screen which doesn't really need this main prop, and it just is past this stuff right here. And navigation is this is the name that I earlier spoke about, and just tells React Native where to go. That's about it for this screen. Right, so when the user clicks either resources or applications, the user is taken to the home screen. The home screen is this one. Well, what happens in the home screen is it takes the raw data, the application and the resources data that was passed in from the parent component, which was the first screen. It takes this stuff in. Actually, this is application deep dive. It takes this stuff in and also takes in the main. In this case, it's since we're in resources, it's resource, and home gets this through the main prop, which is destructured from route.params, and we have either costs or quantities, and on click of this cost, we navigate to the graph component, which we'll go to next, the graph component, and we pass in the main raw applications and resources data. The main is again from the parent component, which in this case is a resource, so that each data point is shown. And if quantities is clicked, the display is sent in as quantities, and that's about it for this screen. From the home screen we go to the graph screen. What the graph screen is basically based on where you come in from. If you come in from resources, then it shows you the data points of each resource. So this data point could either be the total cost of number one, because we came in through cost. Number one is logic apps, and the total cost is 576. So yeah, let's go through the code. This is the component level state. We'll go through this one. So what this use effect does is count and labels is basically just to set this part of the graph. And if the main is resource from the previous screen, we came in through home, and if home sent in main as resource, then we're gonna show resource specific stuff. If the main was, however, applications, like in this case, we show application stuff. But right now it's resources. So we initialize an empty object, and what filtered resource is basically for each resource in the resources API data. We can just console.log resources to just check what it is. Yeah, so resources data is basically each resource in the API data, and for each of those resources we're filtering the raw data, and each item we're checking if that particular item's meter category is the current resource in the loop. So if we quickly check what this raw stuff is here, we're just checking if the meter category, which in this case is logic apps, is the current meter resource in the loop. So yeah, for the first time it's going to be logic apps. It's going to look at this item and say, hey, yeah, look, this thing's meter category is logic apps, and let's put this into the filtered resources array. So it's going to add that item into filtered resources. Now we initialize cost and quantity to 0, and for each of so now the filtered resources should have, let's just check what. Oh my god, wait, let me remove the other console.logs and clear this up and run it again. Yeah, so each of these are the data point for each resource. Maybe if we just check which resource it is. Yeah, so API management has 20 items in the raw data, which has its meter category as API management, and similarly maybe Azure Data Factory v2 has, yeah, basically we're just getting all this stuff and then we're initializing cost and quantity to 0 for each resource, and we're going through each of this item for each resource, and we're basically summing up the quantities and costs. And obj was initially empty for in each loop. It's going to start as an empty object, and at this particular resource, for example, if we start off with logic apps, object dot logic apps dot cost, we're setting it to the total cost that we've summed up, and the quantity is the same thing, and we're then making sure that all the data that we already have, like for example in the first loop it's going to be logic apps, maybe by the end when it comes to Azure database for Postgres, we don't want to lose all the other data that we've collected so far, all the other data points. How many are there? 23. We don't want to lose all those, so we're repeatedly copying those things into object and setting it back into object and setting resource details as the object. So in the end what we're going to have is, let me just quickly remove this console.log. In the end what we're going to have is this: the cost and the quantity for each resource. So that's what helps us to so if bandwidth has a cost of 480, I don't know what bandwidth is, let's say it's this or something over here, that's what's going to come and set the data point over here. We have that data now. Yeah, so the same thing is done for applications. If the main was applications, if we had come through applications, the same stuff goes on over here, but instead of resource it's application. And we're setting the graph labels to labels. Earlier labels is basically just an empty array in the beginning, and count is 0. We're just increasing count and pushing the label, pushing the count in for each resource or application based on where we are. I could have just used string interpolation maybe, and not repeated this code, but okay, what set data is let's go to where it's called before we come here. Okay, yeah, so this use effect, okay, chart config and set graph data is basically this library specific. This library to display the graph wants some chart config apparently, and And set graph data, the data is what we're going to go through soon, and the labels is we've already set it. What this use effect does is it first checks if resource details, the thing that we just saw, if this thing has stuff in it. Only if it does, where is it? Only if it does will all this happen. So what? Okay, yeah. Now set data is called. Set data. What it does is basically make sure that resource details has stuff in it. It's going to initialize an empty array as the data, and it's going to go through each of it's going to check if the main is first resource, otherwise it's going to do application specific stuff. It's going to check if this is actually pretty much useless. We're sending it in, so it should work even without this. Oh my god, let's hope it works. It should work. Earlier I was making the API call here, so it made sense then, but no, since I'm sending it in from the parent component, it's not really required, right? So for each resource in the resources thing, in the resources API data, we're pushing resource details at resource. So the resource details at API management, for example, they're either cost or quantity based on what we want to display here. So we're getting it over here. When set data is called, it's called with that particular thing. So that's it. Now we have a data array with all the data points that we can display in the graph. And this is where it's sent, cost or quantity. And the flag business is just so that there's no infinite loop, and it just doesn't keep re-rendering because I've put two conflicting things in the same function. I could have removed it and separated concerns, but if right, so if the display is cost, then we're just basically here we're calculating the total cost. We're just going through the data array and adding it up and up, adding each data value up so that we get the total, and that's it for this screen. And when legend is clicked, we go to the legend screen, and we also pass in here the main we pass in is the resources API data itself, so that we can it's easy for me to just render it from the API data itself. And I'm also sending in final cost data and final quantity data, which was earlier calculated here, and it's calculated from set data. Set data basically just gets that array. So we're sending in the array of cost, we're sending in the array of quantity, so that each one of this one will probably get the 0th item in the array of both cost and quantity, and it's going to display that stuff. So that's it for the screen. And each component has a styles component, which is just styling. So from the graph screen, we have a button here that goes into the legend screen, and into the legend screen we pass in the main is basically resources. So we're passing in the resources data so that we can easily pull out the names and render it. And we're also sending in final cost data and finally final quantity data, which we're setting over here. It's basically calling set data, and I think we went through that. So when we click legend, go on the legend screen, and what legend does is it's just adding numbers to each of the resources, in this case, and applications. And if you come through applications, it'll add numbers to applications based on main. Yeah, these are all applications. It's just gonna add them, and yeah, it's gonna in once one of these buttons are clicked, it's gonna get into this. It's gonna get into the resource details screen. And it's gonna pass in the cost and quantity for that particular resource. Because we're mapping here, and for each item we're sending in that particular item's cost and resource. The count here is basically that's where we're getting the index of the item, so that we're getting in the right cost and quantity in. So that's it for the legend and resource detail screen. It's pretty simple. What resource detail screen does is some have the cost and quantities is 0, some just have one thing is 0. For example, cost could be 0 or quantities could be 0. Some just have both of them as 0, right? Yeah, so the resource detail screen just gets stuff in from the legend and displays it. Basically, that's it. So when the user decides to click on application deep dive button, they get into this screen, the application deep dive screen. I'm sorry for that noise. Yeah, so he clicks on it, and from the parent component, which was the first screen, raw applications and resources passed along to application deep dive, and this is the component level state. Application raw and resources are obtained from the parent component. And what this screen does, there's loads of fun logic in here. So for each resource in the resources API, we're filtering the resource based on its meter category again and setting it to obj. So we quickly look at obj. Yeah, so the same stuff, all the raw data, but it'll have the meter category as Azure Data Factory. So we're doing that for application for resources. We're also doing that for applications, and we're setting it to resource details and application details respectively. Yeah, Delaware deposit, plastic, and all that kind of application stuff, but this time it'll be filtered based on its tag name. 1080p lock. The resource group will be similar to this, will be the same as that, in fact, right? So we're setting it in state, set application details. So application details and resource details will have that data, and then we're calling get application deep data. This is where most of this logic happens. Like, let's just go to computers. It has loads of stuff. That's extremely slow for some reason. Right. I think it's because I'm screen recording and running a server. Yeah. So it gets into application deep data, where for each application, all the resources used for that particular application is displayed, and also the cost for each resource under that application is calculated. So for example, if we're in 1080 log, it's going to check the meter category. If Azure app service is there, it's going to add this as a key into an object and go on checking. Like, imagine if this was not Azure app service, if this was logic apps, it would also add this as a key, and for all the logic apps and all this data, it's going to add the cost up and display it. That's what this stuff does. So for each application and application details which we just got, it's gonna check if application deep info, this empty object, already has the application, for example computers, as a key. If not, add it as a key and initialize the value to an empty object. And for each item in the application details for a particular application, so this stuff, so for 1080p lock, each each one of these each one of these data entries, these items, if application deep info, this application deep info at application at 1080p log at meter category, so we're checking if it does have Azure app service. If it does not have Azure app service, then add it as a key again and initialize the value to 0, cost 0 and quantity to 0. So by the end of this we should have something like so this stuff should give 0 0 0 0 for all the costs and quantities for, what did I have to remove? Yeah, so it gets in all the resources, it finds all the resources and it initializes the cost and quantity to 0. So that's what that part does. And this part, what it does is it's gonna calculate the costs and values basically. So for each application and application details, for each one of these things, for each one of the data entries in computers, it's gonna check for it's gonna check each item in application deep info this time. For no, application deep info at application already has this kind of stuff. So at Granite, for example, has these 4 or 5 resources. So for each of those resources, if the item's meter category is this, then we're just adding up the costs for each one of them. So for each item, if it ever encounters a meter category that is the same as this res, it's gonna add to the cost. So by the end of this, it should be something like it should have the costs and quantities basically. Yeah, it has all the costs and quantities for everything. Yeah, some of them have 0 cost and some quantity. Maybe there's like some deal going on, like you buy this service, I'll give you this one for free. I don't know what's happening there. Render applications is basically this. It's gonna render each one of these things. It goes through each one of the applications and the application stuff. Final app data, set final app data, application deep info, right? So application deep info is set into final app data, and for each one of the keys there, just render this stuff. And when a button is clicked, we're navigating to show resources application, and we're sending in the app data. So the at final app data at app, so final app data at industrial is passed into, if industrial is clicked, then because for each app we're going in with, and we're sending that in, and we're also sending in the name. So when that's clicked, we're going into, this is basically the resources screen. So what this is, what's being rendered right now, this is the render application. When we click on something, then we go into show resources in application, which just takes stuff from which just takes app data and app and just displays it basically. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.